Have you ever wondered how the one person everyone wanted to replace became the only reason 27 innocent children made it home alive? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never judge someone's value by their age again. On the quiet streets of Maple Creek, every school day began the same way. Before the sun had fully risen, an old yellow school bus slowly rolled through the neighborhoods, stopping at every familiar corner. Sitting behind the steering wheel was 70-year-old Thomas Walker, a gentle man with silver hair, kind blue eyes, and a warm smile that had greeted generations of children for more than 40 years. Every child called him Mr. Thomas. Some waved excitedly before climbing aboard, while others rushed to tell him about their homework, their dreams, or the little adventures from the day before. He remembered every child's name, every birthday, and even which student needed a few extra words of encouragement before an important exam. To the children, he wasn't just a bus driver. He was family. But not everyone saw him that way. Over the past few months, some parents had started whispering that he had become too old for the job. They complained that he drove too carefully and that the younger drivers finished their routes much faster. During school board meetings, people quietly suggested that it was finally time for Thomas to retire. 40 years is enough, one official said. Technology has changed. We need younger drivers who can depend on modern systems. Thomas never argued with anyone. He simply smiled, thanked them politely, and continued doing what he had always done. Every single morning, before allowing even one child onto the bus, he personally inspected every tire, every light, every emergency exit, and every brake. The younger drivers often laughed at him. The mechanics already checked everything, one of them joked. "You're wasting your time." Thomas simply smiled and replied with the same words he had spoken for decades. Children deserve certainty, not assumptions. Hidden inside his worn leather bag was something everyone else considered useless, an old paper map, filled with handwritten notes, collected over 40 years. Every shortcut, every narrow country road, every flooded creek, every dangerous bridge, every steep hill, and every safe detour had been carefully marked in faded blue ink. Whenever someone saw him unfold that map, they laughed. "Who still carries paper maps?" they asked. Thomas would quietly fold it back into his bag and answer, "Technology is wonderful, until it stops working." No one took those words seriously. Among all the children, little Emma loved sitting in the very first seat. She was only 8 years old, curious about everything, and she asked questions almost every morning. One afternoon, while Thomas carefully drove across an old wooden bridge, Emma smiled and asked, "Mr. Thomas, why do you still look at that old map when the bus already has GPS?" Thomas looked ahead with calm eyes before answering. "Because machines only remember what they're programmed to know. Experience remembers what life teaches." Emma smiled, even though she didn't fully understand what he meant. Neither did anyone else. As the final school day before the weekend came to an end, children climbed onto the bus laughing, trading jokes and talking excitedly about their plans. Parents waved goodbye, teachers locked the school doors, and the town settled into another peaceful Friday afternoon. But far beyond the mountains, dark storm clouds were quietly gathering. The weather forecast had predicted only light rain, so nobody paid much attention. Only Thomas noticed something unusual. The wind felt different. The birds had suddenly disappeared from the sky. Even the air carried a strange silence that he had learned to recognize after decades behind the wheel. He paused for a moment before starting the engine, looked toward the horizon, and gently reached into his old leather bag. Without saying a word, he unfolded the faded paper map one more time. A quiet feeling settled deep inside his heart. Something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it, but experience had taught him that sometimes the road speaks long before danger arrives. And within the next hour, that feeling would become the difference between life and death for 27 innocent children. If you're enjoying this story, stay with Fireside Files, because what happened next transformed an ordinary school bus driver into the greatest hero Maple Creek had ever known. The first few drops of rain landed softly against the windshield as Thomas slowly pulled the bus away from the school. None of the children paid much attention. They were laughing, sharing snacks, and talking excitedly about the weekend ahead. Emma sat in the front seat, watching tiny raindrops race across the glass while Thomas quietly kept his eyes fixed on the road. Within minutes, the peaceful rain turned into a violent storm. Dark clouds swallowed the afternoon sunlight, powerful winds bent the trees along the roadside, and thunder echoed across the mountains like distant explosions. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His instincts were growing louder with every passing mile. Suddenly, the bus dashboard flashed a warning. The GPS screen froze for a moment, flickered twice, then went completely black. One of the older children leaned forward and said, "Mr. Thomas, the navigation stopped working." Thomas didn't panic. He calmly nodded as though he had expected it all along. "That's all right," he said with a gentle smile. "I know these roads better than any computer." A few minutes later, traffic ahead came to a complete stop. Flashing emergency lights reflected through the heavy rain. Police officers were waving vehicles away from the main highway. A large section of the road had disappeared beneath fast-moving floodwater. Drivers began making U-turns, desperately opening navigation apps, only to discover that every nearby road was either blocked or already underwater. Parents waiting at home started calling the school in fear, but phone signals were becoming weaker every minute. Inside the bus, the younger children slowly fell silent. Some pressed their faces against the windows, watching the fierce rain. Others clutched their backpacks tightly, sensing that something wasn't right. Little Emma looked at Thomas and quietly whispered, "Are we going to be okay?" Thomas looked at her in the rearview mirror and smiled with complete confidence. "As long as we stay together, we're going home." Those simple words calmed every child on the bus. While dozens of drivers argued outside, Thomas quietly reached into his old leather bag and unfolded the weathered paper map. His fingers moved across faded blue markings until they stopped on a narrow country road almost no one remembered anymore. 40 years earlier, before the new highway had been built, school buses had used that route every winter whenever the main bridge became dangerous. It wasn't marked on modern GPS systems anymore because almost nobody drove there. Most people had forgotten it even existed. Thomas remembered every curve, every hill, and every wooden fence along that forgotten road. One police officer noticed the old bus turning away from the traffic and immediately stepped in front of it. "Sir, that road isn't on the emergency route," he shouted over the storm. Thomas respectfully lowered his window despite the rain pouring inside. "I know," he answered calmly. "But I also know it's higher ground, and it never floods." The officer hesitated. Behind him, Experienced rescue workers were still studying digital maps that offered no solution. Finally, the officer looked into Thomas's calm eyes and slowly stepped aside. "Be careful," he said. Thomas nodded, closed the window, and gently guided the bus toward the forgotten country road. The storm grew even worse. Thick branches crashed onto the road behind them, making it impossible to turn back. Lightning illuminated the dark forest surrounding the narrow lane. Water rushed through nearby fields, but just as Thomas remembered, the old road remained safely above the flood. The children watched in complete silence as the bus carefully climbed through the hills. Every bump echoed inside the bus, yet Thomas's hands never shook. His breathing remained calm, his eyes never left the road, and every decision came from decades of experience rather than fear. No one inside the bus realized it yet, but while hundreds of vehicles remained trapped on flooded highways, one elderly driver carrying 27 innocent children was quietly leading them toward the only safe path left in all of Maple Creek. And just when it seemed they had escaped the worst of the storm, a deafening crack echoed through the valley ahead. Thomas immediately pressed the brakes. The children gasped as the bus came to a stop. Less than 50 yards in front of them, the old wooden bridge they needed to cross had partially collapsed into the raging river below. For the first time that afternoon, complete silence filled the bus. Every child looked toward Thomas, waiting for him to decide what would happen next. If you think this story can't become any more intense, stay with Fireside Files, because the decision Thomas makes in the next few minutes will determine whether 27 children ever see their families again. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. Rain hammered against the roof of the bus, while the swollen river below roared louder than the thunder itself. The old wooden bridge had not completely disappeared, but a large section in the middle had collapsed into the rushing water, leaving a terrifying gap. One wrong move would send the entire bus into the river. Several of the younger children began to cry quietly. Emma held her backpack tightly and looked at Thomas with frightened eyes. "Mr. Thomas, are we trapped?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He carefully switched off the engine, stepped out into the pouring rain, and slowly walked toward the damaged bridge. Every step was calm, measured, and confident. The cold wind pushed against him as he examined the broken structure, with decades of experience guiding every thought. He noticed something no one else would have seen. The main support beams underneath the bridge were still standing. Only the wooden driving surface had collapsed in one section. If that missing section could somehow be crossed without placing the bus directly over the broken planks, there was still hope. Thomas walked back to the bus, opened one of the storage compartments, and removed several heavy wooden emergency boards that had remained inside the vehicle for years. Most drivers never carried them anymore because modern rescue teams usually arrived quickly. Thomas had never removed them. "You never know when old tools become the only tools," he often said. Without wasting another second, he began laying the reinforced boards across the damaged section, securing them as firmly as possible. Two older students quietly stepped off the bus despite the rain. "Can we help you, Mr. Thomas?" one of them asked. Thomas smiled proudly. "Only if you promise to listen carefully." Together they worked through the storm, lifting heavy boards while lightning flashed across the sky. Every child watched through the windows in complete silence. Time seemed to stand still. Finally, after checking every board again and again, Thomas climbed back into the driver's seat. His uniform was soaked, but his hands remained steady. He looked at every child before speaking. "Listen to me carefully. Everyone will stay seated. Nobody stands up. Nobody screams. Trust me. 27 frightened faces quietly nodded. Thomas started the engine once again. The bus slowly rolled toward the damaged bridge. Every tire moved only inches at a time. The wooden boards groaned beneath the weight, and the rushing river thundered only a few feet below. Inside the bus, no one breathed. Outside, the storm continued to rage without mercy. Halfway across, a loud cracking sound echoed beneath the bus. Several children screamed. The bus leaned slightly toward the broken side. Thomas immediately stopped. Panic filled the air, but he remained completely calm. He knew exactly what had happened. One of the temporary boards had shifted. Without showing even the smallest sign of fear, he quietly set the parking brake and looked back at the children. "Everything is all right," he said gently. "Stay exactly where you are." He stepped back into the storm, crawled beneath the front of the bus despite the freezing water, and with incredible determination forced the heavy board back into position, using nothing but a steel emergency jack and his own strength. His hands bled as rough splinters cut through his skin, but he refused to stop. After several exhausting minutes, he climbed back into the driver's seat. Water dripped from his face, his breathing was heavy, yet his eyes remained calm. Slowly, inch by inch, the old yellow bus crossed the final section of the bridge. The moment the rear wheels touched solid ground, every child burst into tears and applause at the same time. Some hugged each other. Others simply cried with relief. Emma wiped away her tears and whispered, "I knew you'd bring us home." Thomas smiled softly but kept driving. There was still one more journey to finish. One by one, he stopped at every house despite flooded roads and fallen trees. At each stop, terrified parents ran through the rain and wrapped their children in desperate hugs. Some cried openly. Others couldn't even find words to thank him. News spread across Maple Creek faster than the storm itself. The old school bus driver everyone wanted to replace had just done what no modern technology, no GPS, and no one else had been able to do. He had brought all 27 children safely home. The next morning, when the storm finally passed, the entire town gathered outside the school. The same officials who had quietly discussed retiring Thomas only days before stood silently waiting. As the familiar yellow bus slowly pulled into the parking lot, every parent, every teacher, every police officer, and every child began applauding. Thomas stepped off the bus, surprised by the crowd. The school principal walked forward with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice trembling, "yesterday you didn't just drive a bus. You saved 27 families from the worst day of their lives. We almost forgot that experience cannot be replaced by technology. Please forgive us." Thomas smiled with the same quiet kindness he had shown for 40 years. "The real heroes," he replied, "are the children who stayed brave when they had every reason to be afraid." Little Emma ran forward and hugged him as tightly as she could. The entire crowd applauded even louder. A week later, the school board made a unanimous decision. Instead of retiring Thomas, they asked him to become the head trainer for every new school bus driver in the county, ensuring that his wisdom, patience, and decades of experience would protect children for generations to come. The old paper map was framed and placed inside the school entrance, with a small bronze plaque beneath it that read, "Experience guided the way when technology could not." Years later, children who had been on that bus would tell their own sons and daughters about the quiet old driver who never chased recognition, never argued with those who doubted him, and proved that true heroes don't wear capes, They simply refuse to give up when others are depending on them. If this story touched your heart, remember to like,